Yeah.
Yeah, I have my proposal for a flag library, but it's not quite in shape yet. So I'm just going to send that out later today.
Yeah, I think we could probably discuss. Yeah, I could do the introduction as well. Hi and welcome everyone to the work group component standard meeting. This is our second meeting. We had one 2 weeks ago, but then last week we had no chairs chairs
Yeah.
available, unfortunately. But
Do we want to do
yeah,
this every week? Because we originally planned to do it every other week.
if possible, yeah, maybe we'll switch. I don't know. I think it could make sense to have like half an hour every week, but at the same time, if folks are missing, it's easy to cancel,
Yeah, I can
I
change
guess.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I'll take care of that later today.
cool. But that's I think we now got the label, the workgroup standard label with regards to infrastructure. So that is good. We should then be able to start using, or we should be able to start using that. And I still have to we still have to add the stakeholder SIGs thing in the community repo to get this off the ground. But
Yeah, I've got a to-do list of updates to 6YAML today.
yeah, there was some outstanding feedback, right? To the
Yes.
to the non-blocking to the original PR. Yeah, I can review that later. But one of the things that is on my to-do list that I haven't got around it to yet. I'll do it as soon as possible, but it's the enhancement issues. Last time we talked in C class lifecycle, I think that was 2 weeks ago. Yes. Then Aaron from the release team said that he would like an enhancement issue for component base and also for every graduation of every component config. So I'll try to create that tomorrow, hopefully. So then, even though we don't like do anything, it's tracked there, and we can.
That's a good idea, and
Yeah,
yeah, we
like
should do that.
it's there, so people see it will happen at least eventually, right?
Yeah.
It's something that is on our to-do list, and whether we can make it next time or next release or the one after that is to be seen. But yeah. Anything other that relates to infrastructure of this work group?
I can't think of anything off the top of my head. Other than I'll add moving the meeting to the notes.
Yeah, and obviously as we do more of these, we'll have people more people join as well. Obviously, because like now we just got this off the ground, like legally in the community,
Yes.
like with the PR merging like 2 weeks ago or something.
Yes. There were a lot of people in our first meeting. But there was
Yeah.
more to discuss as well. So I may also start looking at what to do with config Z as an endpoint, or discovering what the runtime config is.
I think strategically, the next thing to do is a new KEP for the KEP for component standards. I think that would be maybe the most logical thing, like to aggregate, maybe even on a high level. Like we could start easy, and just list here are all the things we think should be in a Kubernetes component or whatever, and then we can deep dive into them in like further proposals or something. But like the flag thing is one of them. Like we can just say that.
So the goal of this KEP would just be to enumerate all of the like subcomponents that we expect a Kubernetes component to be built on. Is that?
Yes. So I think that kind of overall aggregation of stuff to have would be beneficial, and maybe it's the next step with regards to like here. That also probably will make this group more structured as well, because we can see that, oh, this is the 5 things we think every component should have, and then we can focus on these 5 items and say, like, okay, let's start with item 1, which might be a flag and config merging, and then we'll write a more detailed, like we'll describe in a high level that this should work like this, and then in details with all the edge cases or whatever in a separate KEP, if needed.
Yeah, I think we'd enumerated a few already, right, in the original KEP for the working group. Or the KEP that you wrote, the KEP 32, the one for creating component base, right? So that shouldn't be too, but I think there's more, possibly more than that as well.
Yes, and I also think the scope of having a standard or component standard is larger than the scope of component base, probably.
Yes, probably. So, well, possibly. We'll see. It's definitely possible. Yeah, to me, component base is more a question of like we needed a place to put this stuff. And that's the purpose it serves. Whether it makes sense to have another common location for something that's broader in scope is. Okay, yeah. So we can do that. I would expect as well that, like, even if as we enumerate things in that doc, people are gonna want to go work on parts they care about, whether they show up in there or not. So we'll probably end up with proposals that say, hey, look, this is a good idea for components. Also, it wasn't in this enumeration, and we're still open to that.
Yeah. So things like that I would like to see that doesn't exist in a component today is like for Kubeless and kubeproxy and all these, like either have a flag that would print its open API specs, or for the config, or like endpoint in the HTTP server. Would be great.
Yes, some API discovery mechanism for the components API. Yeah, and that could even go further. Like today we rely on Cobra a lot for help text generation.
Yeah.
And that's I mean, excluding kube control, that is, I think, the main reason we use Cobra in a lot of our components. Like, it shouldn't really be necessary otherwise, because the only other things we use it for are like parsing flags. And yeah, so it's mostly the help and usage flags, and then the documentation generator that directly links the binaries.
Yeah. So for example, those things I think we'll dive into more in that kind of proposal. That's like what is needed, what is not, and so.
Yeah. I actually had a list in, and I'll send a PR today with like a markdown version of the doc I shared with you and Stefan for everybody to look at. But there's a list of non-goals in there that just enumerates other KEPs we'll probably write in the future. Which might be helpful.
Yeah. And if we discuss a bit the K flag thing, as I understood it, I haven't had time to like deep dive into it, but as I understood it, there are two main proposed ways of doing, or like Stefan has something and you have something, and I
Yes.
probably have something. So
Yeah, we have like I'd rather just publish it publicly, and we can hash that out in comments.
yeah. But on a high level, like if you would describe it in 5 sentences, something.
Yeah. So the main so there's two things that are bundled into this cap. And if you go read that version component configuration files doc I wrote last year, that doc basically goes through implementing component config in the kubelet and all the problems we ran into, and like how we solved them there. And this cap is targeted at making two of those problems easier to solve. One of the problems is enforcing flag precedence during your bootstrap sequence. So if you've been incrementally migrating flags into a component config structure that is read from a file or read dynamically from some other remote source, for backwards compatibility reasons, you need to overlay the values, any values that are set by flags, onto the config object before you make decisions based on that object. And the way it's implemented in the kubelet was rather tricky because it involves reparsing the command line, but also you have to do all these things to be careful not to reparse parts of it you don't control, like any global flags. You have to be wary of anything that might be like an accumulator across multiple flag invocations, because then instead of replacing the values when you reparse, you'll accumulate them. And there's all kinds of things that were just like really mind twists implementing that. And even reading the kubelet's bootstrap sequence isn't like as straightforward as it could be. So one goal of this is to provide a library that kind of moves some functionality into the front end of flag registration so that you can actually decouple the step of registering a flag on the command line from applying any value set on that flag to some arbitrary object. So now, instead of having to reparse the command line, I parse it once. All of those values go into a scratch space that's allocated by the flag registration. And then when I want to actually apply those to a config, I just call an apply function against an arbitrary config. And that just lets us kind of clean up that bootstrap process and also make the ability to enforce flag precedence accessible to everyone without them having to do their own implementations of it.
Right. And
yeah. So that was one problem. And then the other one was just like some helpers for importing any globally registered third-party flags into your flag set that you're going to parse.
Yeah. So if I understood it correctly, you will also provide, so if I register a string flag just on my own custom object, I parse a command line, and when I choose to apply that to my newly created config, it will apply that string value automatically. That's being like staged in between parsing and applying. So it will apply that automatically. But if I want to, and only if I specify a separate function, I can override that or like customize that apply.
Yes.
So but the default is to like work as before, right?
Yeah. So I can send an example PR too with like a few different flag types implemented, so you can see how that works. But yeah, basically, each type will get one or a few helpers to define that merge functionality. So you might have a replace. You might have, for something like a map, you might have a merge that merges keys. You might have, so I have, in the current example, I have one called custom that just takes a user-defined apply function as an extension point. Yeah, so that's basically right.
Okay, cool. That sounds reasonable. one thing that I would hope is that it would be a drop-in replacement from pflag, which address
It's not quite drop-in. It's pretty close. You have to do a little bit more during flag registration. Stefan's example is more drop-in like. But there's a point of contention that Stefan and I have to work out, which is that there's two things that I'm worried about with his approach. One is, so like in the kubelet, we definitely have to apply the flags to multiple different configs at the moment, because we load dynamic config and then have to apply it to that. In all cases if you're using a file, in all cases after you've already loaded the file. And Stefan's example, if I remember right, was able to load new data from like a file into an existing config object that had already had flags registered against it. And I think that, so for me, that's a little bit harder to reason about edge cases, because you're loading into like pre-existing data, and so making sure things are cleared properly or redefaulted properly or like whatever you have to do. We would just have to write a lot of tests to make sure that that works. And Stefan can correct me if in fact it's much easier to think about than I'm thinking.
Yeah. I had also, like, initially when just thinking about this, I discovered that pflag actually supports like you can actually defer the set.
You can say that again.
That is possible with pflag to defer the set setting of, like, effectively the apply of the command. Like, you can parse it but then wait for the apply. That is possible already, but that has a problem.
Really? Where's what's the, I didn't notice that. What's the
it's like, you can, if you check out the parse all thing, like you have to write some custom code, but it's possible with parse all.
Oh.
That does, like, that gives you a function per flag or something. So then you can choose whether to set it or not to set it. If you can just
and you use the string-based set function. Yeah. Okay, that's interesting as well. You said there's a problem with that though.
Yeah, the problem is, like, if I create the if I bind my thing, I create a new empty defaulted object, I bind my flags to that. If I parse a command line, set just the config and defer the others, I will check the config and realize that, hey, I should load a config. Then I load a config and get a new object. So either I decode the config, like, somehow into the earlier populated flag thing, or I don't know. Like,
yeah, so either way, you need an intermediary scratch space.
Yeah, I repoint the pointer or whatever. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
So
So either way, you're juggling strings and like doing storage. I tried to, and Stefan had some comments on the original doc that helped me mostly avoid keeping explicit maps, other than what pflag does internally. And I think the way I have to do it is pretty much completely type safe as well.
Cool.
Yeah, so I'll share that later today. I just have to clean up the docs.
That sounds great. Another point of discussion is, what do we do with the controller manager, just to move from A to B? Because that, I was pushing that 1.5 weeks ago or something, and together with Stuart UI, and then we kind of, I fell off the thread because I didn't have time then. But I problem is, like, we want to split our controller configs to different, like, config should be local to the controller, right? And
Yes.
and then we made this intermediate step in Stuart's PR, and then we got feedback from API Machiner that it's no better than, like, moving the package, the config close to the controller was no better than whatever, I don't remember exactly.
I have to
And
follow
then,
up. I haven't
yeah,
followed the discussion closely.
and yeah, and they suggested that we should rethink, or like, they suggested that we should think about just using external types. So for component configs, as they are, I don't know, so simple, and that might actually make sense. So that the fields that we don't want to serialize, we just put the JSON, like, what is it called, the hyphen or whatever character. Anyway, the exclude mark for such things we don't want serialized, and that may be used
I'm
in
not
conversion.
following with this. Like, yeah, I'm not. I don't know, because like using, to me, like, even in an external type, every field is typically serialized, right?
Yeah.
So where's the idea of excluding certain fields coming from?
So it's just needed for conversion, right? So we have.
So instead of
Yeah.
like making the
So
internal type represent all
for
external
the round trips. So yeah, so it's just for that, but it would simplify some of our stuff with regards to overhead with internal to latest stable conversions.
I'm not sure, like,
But
so you would, in every, so say you have 3 versions of your config with the 3 partially disjoint versions of your config. Then each of those needs to duplicate the disjoint fields with the others, right?
no, we would only convert.
Or would we only convert linearly through the?
So kind of what he said was like, and that feedback I can take is that we basically, well, he was having this concept of a hub version where you do to which you do all the conversions.
So we use the latest.
Yeah.
So we use alpha whatever as the hub.
Yeah. So whatever is the latest stable that would have exactly the same fields as the internal anyway would be used for directly.
That doesn't work. It doesn't necessarily work, because if you, at least according to our actual deprecation policy in Kubernetes, because after, well, I guess if you, no, it does. So you do have to drop the whole type when you finally drop a field. You do have to drop the entirety of the oldest type.
Yeah.
Version of Kubernetes. So that is okay.
So in the context of the controller manager, he said that
who is saying this? Is this Daniel?
Daniel, yeah.
Okay.
No, David.
David.
Yeah. So I mean, I could buy the idea at the same time that we could try to drop all the, because the controller configs are so small. Like it's just like a sync whatever. so I would maybe be willing with experimenting, so that we would only use the types that are published in the K8 Kube controller manager repo, and we would reference them to our whatever own API group, or like, no, we would create a scheme per or whatever, like make a scheme per config directory, which means that you can like add, and that scheme references the external published types. So that means you can choose any controller.
Sure.
And then you add arbitrary. yeah, those controller kinds would be serializable, and that kind of stuff. So
It's interesting. I think we have to think through the development workflow and how it changes with that shift,
yeah.
right? Because then, like,
So
every time you create a new version, you've got to go change all your code to the new version.
yes, but that is we actually when we've used, you kind of have to do that in any way to a large extent. Although you're using internal versions, what we've done in KubeADM, but yeah, let's just think through it. But I'm just putting in it kind of on our agenda because that is, the PR is there. It's technically ready to be merged, but with those comments, although I was for it, like for merging that PR, but at the same time I could see us experimenting or like going, because like I just think we need to be consistent.
Yeah, that's the thing that I'm thinking too. And ideally, we're as consistent as possible with the way people do other APIs like CRDs and things like that.
Right, but I think that like as long as we're consistent, it's okay. But if we say that this is the way to do components config and feel that doing it only with external versions is okay, we could like prototype. I'm happy to prototype that with the controller manager types because they're like so simple. They have like 2 fields each.
Yes, that would be probably a good place to prototype it.
So, I would kind of be okay with it but we need to think through all the edge cases.
I'm okay with it as like, does the existing API machinery support doing that? I guess it would. It's just a struct.
Yeah.
It doesn't like. There's no way it could get confused by the JSON annotations on the internal type at all. Because we typically don't put those on internal types. I don't know if it tries to read them or if there's any legacy there. I kind of doubt.
So we would have always the external type, and then that would have just the JSON exclude things for the things it needs for conversion.
Right. So
that should work. Or it does work if I've tested it.
Yeah. So one thing to ensure is that excludes for serialization do not impact conversion between types.
Yeah, we'd have to like opt out for conversion on that thing and do that conversion manually. But yeah, it should work like in theory when thinking about it, but in practice, I don't know. So
yeah, that's always the thing. Right?
Just putting it up there.
Different than what we do, so there's risk.
Yeah,
we have to be careful.
But it could be good. So yeah, let's think more about that in upcoming. But the immediate thing next is like Kflag.
Can you put the when you have a chance, put the link to that PR in the notes?
Yes, but we need to end now. Okay.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye. Bye.